Today, I'm going to introduce a book called Enlightenment Now, subtitled The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress. Before we get started, please click on the subscribe button below to stay updated and support Daily Book Dive. The author of this book is the well-known Steven Pinker. Steven Pinker is a world-leading linguist and cognitive psychologist who has taught at MIT and Harvard University. Besides, he is a globally influential science writer and thinker, listed by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential people in the world, and twice by Foreign Policy magazine as a top global thinker. He is truly an encyclopedic scholar. Enlightenment Now covers the most extensive topics. Upon release, the book was highly sought after and appeared on the recommended lists of The New York Times, The Economist, and The Guardian. Many celebrities, including Yuval Noah Harari, author of *Sapiens*, Richard Dawkins, author of *The Selfish Gene*, and Bill Gates have highly recommended it. Why has this book been treated so favorably? Because it can be considered a culmination of Steven Pinker's 40 years of research. If you listen to his books in sequence, you will discover a central theme in Steven Pinker's academic research. In How the Mind Works, Pinker explores where the human mind originates. In The Blank Slate, he investigates the origins of human morality. And in The Better Angels of Our Nature, he uses robust data to show us that, with the development of human history, violent behavior has been significantly reduced. With Enlightenment Now, Pinker gathers these issues into a grander theme, perhaps the ultimate question: what should we do to make the world better? This theme may seem vast, but once you understand Pinker's academic career, you will realize he has the authority to discuss it. For the past 40 years, he has been researching how human minds and morals evolve and how they change the world. Of course, Pinker's answer may not be the ultimate one, but at least we should know his response. The book covers a grand theme, and Steven Pinker elaborates on his views on the contemporary world and humanity through 23 topics. If you have time, I strongly recommend reading the original book. Next, I will introduce Steven Pinker's core views in this book through 3 questions. Part 1. Let's look at the first question. Is the world getting better or worse? Steven Pinker's answer is that the world is getting better. You might feel something is off after hearing this, as we see so many upsetting news stories every day and the world is facing various challenges. What gives Pinker the certainty to declare that the world is getting better? No one can answer this question objectively based on their feelings alone. Only objective facts can serve as a measure. In this book, Pinker cites a lot of data to analyze the world's progress from 16 aspects. His data is very detailed, and the book lists over 100 pages of data sources and references at the end. I've selected 3 of the most important dimensions for you: health, wealth, and knowledge. Let's use these 3 dimensions to assess the current state of the world. First, let's look at health. Let me ask you a question. You know the current average human lifespan? 50 years? 60 years? The answer may surprise you. It's 71.4 years. 200 years ago, the average human lifespan was 29 years. 100 years ago, the average lifespan for Europeans and Americans had risen above 40 years, which increased the global average to 35 years. Over the following 100 years, the average lifespan for Europeans, Americans, and Asians has steadily risen, although it did decline in Africa due to the AIDS epidemic. However, after 2000, the average lifespan in Africa began to increase again. The increase in human lifespan is not only because people today live longer, but also because the infant mortality rate has significantly decreased. In the 19th century, even in the wealthiest European countries, 25% to 30% of children died before the age of 5. Today, even in the poorest countries with the worst medical conditions, this figure has been controlled to below 10%, and in developed countries, the child mortality rate has been reduced to a fraction of a percent. You might ask, although people are living longer, can ordinary people enjoy happier lives? Let's look at the second dimension, wealth. Economists have calculated the global GDP, and it took about 1,500 years for human income to double from the year AD. By 1820, human income had increased to 3 times what it was, but in the nearly 200 years that followed, human income grew to more than 100 times its previous amount. In the early 19th century, the average global income was equivalent to that of the poorest countries in Africa today. By today's standards, nearly 95% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty at that time. Today, the proportion of the global population living in extreme poverty has dropped to below 10%. In the past 20 years, nearly 140,000 people have been lifted out of extreme poverty every day. In 2015, the United Nations set a goal for itself to eradicate extreme poverty worldwide by 2030. If the current rate of reduction in extreme poverty continues, this goal is definitely achievable by 2030. With longer lifespans and more wealth, are humans' spiritual lives also improving? Let's look at the third dimension, knowledge. 200 years ago, 80% of the world's population had not attended school. But today, this number has reversed, with over 80% of people worldwide having received at least basic education. Based on current trends, the proportion of people with basic education is expected to approach 100% by the end of the 21st century. Not only are more people receiving education, but it has also become more equal. 50 years ago, the literacy rate for women worldwide was only 2/3 that of men, but today, women's literacy rates have equaled men's. As a cognitive scientist, Steven Pinker also points out an interesting fact. The more educated the human population is, the higher the average global IQ. Over the past 100 years, the average human IQ has been increasing at a rate of 0.3 points per year. In other words, any ordinary person today, if transported back 100 years, would easily surpass 98% of the people from that era in terms of IQ. This phenomenon best demonstrates the world's progress, as the increase in IQ requires a combination of conditions, including better nutrition, fewer diseases, more wealth, and higher educational levels. The global average IQ is an indicator that reflects the world's progress. In fact, besides health, wealth, and knowledge, there is a fourth important dimension: safety. Pinker has already extensively discussed this dimension in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. In that book, he uses data to prove that overall violence has been decreasing throughout human history. Even the 20th century, despite having 2 world wars, shows no change in this trend when viewed on a larger timescale. You see, based on objective data, humans are becoming healthier, wealthier, more knowledgeable, and safer. The world is indeed getting better. Part 2. Given this, the second question arises: if the data shows the world is getting better, why do we feel the opposite? This pessimistic feeling is common. For example, the question I asked you in Part 1 about the current average human lifespan is from another great book we discuss daily called Factfulness. This book, also based on data, argues that the world is getting better. The author of Factfulness, Hans Rosling, conducted a survey in his home country of Sweden, asking random people to estimate the average global lifespan from options of 50, 60, and 70 years. The results showed that less than 25% of Swedes chose 70 years. Rosling joked that even if he wrote the answer options on bananas and let the chimpanzees at the zoo pick the correct answer, they would perform better than the respondents. Because the chimpanzees would randomly select one of 3 options, achieving an accuracy rate of 33%, which is higher than 25%. Sweden is one of the countries with the longest average lifespans in the world, currently exceeding 80 years. Even so, Swedes are still not very optimistic about the world. Moreover, Rosling's survey included many students and professors who study global health issues. Rather than calling them ignorant, it would be more accurate to say they are overly pessimistic. Why does such pessimism arise? Steven Pinker's identity as a cognitive psychologist comes into play here. Since objective data proves that the world is getting better, the most likely explanation is that there is something wrong with our perception of the world. Pinker summarizes three main reasons in this book, all related to human psychological mechanisms: availability heuristic, sin of ingratitude, and optimism gap. Let me explain these three psychological mechanisms to you. First, let's look at the availability heuristic. This is a psychological term, meaning that when people judge the likelihood of an event, they do not refer to objective data but base their judgment on the first piece of information that comes to mind. For example, if I ask you whether flying or driving is riskier, you will definitely answer flying. Because plane crashes always make headlines. But in fact, according to statistical data, driving is actually riskier. Similarly, in the United States, an average of 4,000 people die from asthma each year, while only 50 are killed by tornadoes. However, Americans are more likely to think that tornadoes are a more common cause of death. The availability heuristic is a mechanism formed in the human brain during the evolutionary process, used for self-protection. Every time we hear bad news, we subconsciously collect it. When making judgments, we refer to the amount of bad news we have heard. The problem is that if we lived in relatively isolated villages, such a mechanism would indeed protect us. Imagine if you were a primitive person and you heard that several people in your tribe had encountered a tiger near the forest to the east. The next time you went hunting, you would definitely avoid the forest to the east, which would be the safest. However, in today's world, the availability heuristic makes it easier for us to make incorrect judgments. Because many media consciously exploit the availability heuristic, spreading bad news to capture people's attention and increase click-through rates. American media scholars have conducted surveys, giving editors some news materials to see which ones they select and how they present them. Observations have shown that when faced with the same set of events, American news workers are more enthusiastic about reporting negative events. Therefore, the easiest way to grab click-through rates is to list all the bad things happening around the world and then draw a sensational conclusion. Modern civilization is facing an unprecedented crisis. There's a saying, report good news, not bad. But for the media, a more effective approach is report more bad news and less good news. Once the media starts consciously exploiting the availability heuristic, we are more likely to feel that the world is full of crises. As a linguist, Pinker also points out another point that reflects human sensitivity to negative news. There are many more words related to negative emotions than there are for positive emotions. The second psychological mechanism is called sin of ingratitude. This term comes from Dante's Divine Comedy, which depicts 9 layers of hell, with the 9th layer named sin of ingratitude. Ironically, it refers to those who do not know how to be grateful. Pinker uses this term in this book to illustrate that when people encounter problems and conflicts, they complain incessantly. But as soon as everything goes smoothly, few people take the initiative to think about how many people have contributed to the peace and prosperity. People tend to forget the world's progress and take everything for granted. Steven Pinker cites an example in this book, the smallpox vaccine, also known as cowpox. In the 20th century alone, smallpox caused at least 300 million deaths. The smallpox vaccine, made from cowpox, completely changed this situation. By the 1980s, humanity had completely eradicated the smallpox virus, except for some samples left in virus laboratories. This is a tremendous achievement, but when it comes to the name Edward Jenner, perhaps not many people will recognize it. Edward Jenner was the first doctor to use cowpox to prevent smallpox. In this book, Steven Pinker also lists several other scientific heroes who have saved lives, such as Abel Wallman, who invented the chlorination of drinking water, saving at least 170 million people. John Enders, who invented the measles vaccine, saving at least 120 million people, and Gaston Ramon, who invented the diphtheria and tetanus vaccines, saving at least 60 million people. However, these names are unfamiliar to us. So, is Pinker accusing humanity of being ungrateful? Not exactly. Although Dante called human forgetfulness sin of ingratitude, Pinker believes that, like the availability heuristic, the sin of ingratitude is also an instinct formed during the brain's evolutionary process. Humans have a psychological baseline. Whether your happiness standard is high or low, it will eventually return to this baseline. There have been studies tracking people who won the lottery jackpot and those who unfortunately had amputations due to accidents. The results showed that after many years, their psychological states had returned to that baseline. Those who won the lottery were not necessarily always happy, and those who were amputated were not necessarily always unhappy. So, from a psychological perspective, it is difficult for people to continuously appreciate the world's gifts. Instead, they gradually take them for granted. As the saying goes, once healed, the scar is forgotten, and the sin of ingratitude is a similar situation, which might be better described as once healed, forget the doctor. The third psychological mechanism is called optimism gap. Simply put, when people evaluate themselves and the world, they often use double standards. When judging themselves, people tend to be more optimistic, but when expanding the issue to society, they are more inclined to be pessimistic. Why are there such double standards? Pinker offers a guess. When we talk about the history of the world, we are used to using wars as markers to divide time, such as after World War I, before World War II, since 9/11, etc. This method of dividing time gives us a psychological suggestion. Every time we review human history, the first things that jump into our minds are wars, disasters, or deaths. When we turn to face the future, we can't help but subconsciously think that history always repeats itself, and such natural and man-made disasters may happen again sooner or later. Thinking of these things, how could people possibly be optimistic? In this book, Pinker also points out a phenomenon. Intellectuals often have a tendency to maintain a serious image and deliberately choose pessimism. It seems that once they are optimistic, they no longer care about the nation or the people. Only by constantly pointing out the problems facing the world can they be considered responsible intellectuals. This attitude of being serious for the sake of seriousness is called progress phobia by Pinker. Availability heuristic, sin of ingratitude, and optimism gap. These three psychological mechanisms work together, causing us to see more negative news every day and to think more about wars and pain when reviewing history, forgetting human achievements. This way, we are indeed easily misled, ignoring objective data and instead believing that the world is getting worse. Part 3. So, it seems that our perception of the world is biased. This leads to the third question: what should we do to correct this cognitive bias? The most important point is to think about the essence of the problem. Humanity, the world, history. It all seems like an incredibly complex model, but in this book, Steven Pinker makes a brilliant deduction, bringing out the most crucial core of the world. Let's follow him and open a mental portal. We are now stepping back from the complexity of human society and looking at it from the perspective of the Earth. When the resolution is lowered, countless pieces of information can be ignored. Pinker tells us that when we re-examine humanity from such a macro perspective, we actually only need three basic concepts to understand the past, present, and future of humanity. The first basic concept to understand the human condition is entropy, a concept in physics that measures the degree of order. You don't need to understand the complex physics involved. Just know that the second law of thermodynamics has proven that the entire universe is evolving towards greater disorder. If humanity does not move forward, our world will crumble like a castle made of sand on the beach. The second basic concept is evolution. Organisms must extract energy from the environment, but energy is limited. Therefore, different organisms will compete for energy, and the evolution of organisms is random. However, organisms that lose this competition will not survive. Entropy and evolution together describe the difficult predicament of humanity. Looking beyond Earth, the universe not only does not care about our needs, but it also seems to hinder us. Humanity is like rowing against the current. If we do not advance, we will retreat. Looking within Earth, evolution determines that hostility is everywhere among organisms. Natural selection itself is a competition among genes to ensure their continuation in the next generation. Humanity once faced strong neighbors and was surrounded by crises. This is the harsh world we face. Fortunately, humanity has its own weapons. This brings us to the third basic concept, information. The essence of information is the reduction of entropy, which distinguishes orderly structured systems from vast amounts of random, useless systems. Humanity's most significant progress is that our cognitive system has evolved the ability to think abstractly. The mind can combine basic concepts such as things, places, directions, people, actions, methods, and purposes into propositions, creating countless ideas. Moreover, humans can not only generate propositions but also generate propositions about propositions. We not only think about specific technical problems such as how to grow wheat for a better harvest, but we also think about the principles behind specific technologies, and we even discuss which ways of thinking are more effective. This is what we mean by propositions about propositions. These things happen to us, and you might feel they are natural, but when compared to other organisms on Earth, you will realize how different humans are. It's hard to imagine a Tyrannosaurus rex pondering, much less pondering which way of thinking is more effective. Only humans have such powerful thinking capabilities, putting us at the forefront in the pursuit of information. So, Steven Pinker leads us to think about human history from such a macro perspective, ultimately concluding that humanity's greatest progress is learning to use information to resist the onslaught of entropy and the pressures of evolution. At this point, the solution becomes very clear. When all your judgments come from rational thinking, when all your thinking is based on objective facts, you are using information as a weapon to the greatest extent. When we return from the perspective of Earth to specific individuals, you will find that this is also our cure for pessimism. Pinker recorded a detail in the book. He went to a university to give a lecture on brain science. He was explaining that scientists generally believe that mental life is constructed by the way the brain functions. A female student in the audience raised her hand and asked, "Then what meaning does my life have?" Pinker found the student's tone very sincere. She was neither depressed nor suicidal, nor was she being sarcastic. She genuinely wanted to know, after the development of science has debunked the religious belief in the immortality of the soul, how should she find meaning and purpose in life? The student's question is, what should we believe in after we stop believing in God? Pinker's answer is to believe in reason. When a person insists on rational thinking, he can develop his potential, improve his reasoning skills through learning and discussion, explain the world through science, and gain insight into the human condition through arts and humanities. Combined with his innate empathy, This allows him to respect others, love others, and help others. Our natural empathy makes us sympathize with the situations of others, while reason enables us to use our intelligence to improve our own and others' conditions. This is a direction worth striving for. So, from the perspective of all humanity, reason is humanity's greatest weapon against this difficult world. From an individual's perspective, reason is also worth becoming our faith. In conclusion, I have finished explaining the essence of Enlightenment Now. Based on objective data, humans are becoming healthier, wealthier, more knowledgeable, and safer. The world is indeed getting better. Availability heuristic, sin of ingratitude, and optimism gap. These three psychological mechanisms work together, causing us to see more negative news every day and to more easily recall wars and pain when reviewing history, forgetting human achievements. This way, we are indeed easily misled, ignoring objective data and instead believing that the world is getting worse. How can we correct this cognitive bias? Pinker's antidote is reason. From the perspective of all humanity, reason is humanity's greatest weapon against this difficult world. From an individual's perspective, reason is also worth becoming our faith. Finally, I would like to share my own thoughts. After reading this book, I realized that Pinker's description of the world has given me a lot of new knowledge. But when it comes to solutions, he doesn't seem to offer any surprising or unique insights. Pinker himself admits that the solutions he proposes have already been thoroughly discussed by the thinkers of the Enlightenment movement that began in the 17th century. The reason he titled this book Enlightenment Now is to say that in the 21st century, we are inheriting the ideas and spirit of the Enlightenment movement, reaffirming the importance of reason. But the lack of new solutions, merely reaffirming, does not mean Pinker's views are meaningless. We always have a misconception that new is better and old is outdated. This might be true for knowledge because it is constantly updated, but concepts and solutions are not necessarily so. If each crisis and challenge humanity faces has common elements, then the solutions are likely to be similar. This is like solving a math problem. The same question will inevitably yield the same answer. If you insist on seeking novelty and change, demanding a different answer, you will end up with the wrong answer. Discarding the distinction between old and new, directly addressing the core of the problem, and finding effective answers is also a form of remarkable rational thinking. The original book link is attached at the end for further reading. You can also click the share button below the video to share this book with your friends. Congratulations, you've just finished another book.